We're going to read God's word. It's a long section that we've got today, so I've just chosen one chapter in the middle of our section. We're going really from chapter 7, verse 8, all the way to the end of chapter 10. And so we're just going to read chapter 9 of Exodus this morning, chapter 9. So a little bit of context. We left the story last week with God effectively saying, now look what I'm going to do. We've had something of a cul-de-sac in chapter 5. It's been a bit confusing as to what's going on. The expectations of the nation were lifted up. God is on our side. He's going to rescue us. And it doesn't really go that well, does it, with Pharaoh? In fact, things get worse. Things get harder. And now, without Israel's support, Israel weighed down by slavery, weighed down by Egypt. They're not really on board with the mission. Moses and Aaron are sent back into Pharaoh to be able to bring God's word, let my people go. And here we'll see now what God will do. Chapter 7 has seen Moses come before Pharaoh and display his power by that one of those signs. So a staff is put before Pharaoh, Aaron's staff, and it turns into a serpent. The Egyptian magicians are able to do a similar trick, and yet Aaron's staff, serpent, swallows up theirs. Then water is turned to blood. Then there's a plague of frogs, and then a plague of gnats, then a plague of flies, and then we come to chapter 9. Then the Lord said to Moses, go into Pharaoh and say to him, thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, let my people go that they may serve me. For if you refuse to let them go and still hold them, behold, the hand of the Lord will fall with a very severe plague upon your livestock, that they're in the field, the horses, the donkeys, the camels, the herds, and the flocks. But the Lord will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt, so that nothing of all that belongs to the people of Israel shall die. And the Lord set a time, saying, tomorrow the Lord will do this thing in the land. And the next day the Lord did this thing. All the livestock of the Egyptians died, but not one of the livestock of the people of Israel died. And Pharaoh sent, and behold, not one of the livestock of Israel was dead. But the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, and he did not let the people go. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, take handfuls of soot from the kiln, and let Moses throw them in the air in the sight of Pharaoh. It shall become fine dust over all the land of Egypt, and become boils breaking out in sores on man and beast throughout all the land of Egypt. So they took soot from the kiln, stood before Pharaoh, and Moses threw it in the air, and it became boils breaking out in sores on man and beast. And the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils. For the boils came upon the magicians and upon all the Egyptians. But the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he did not speak to them as the Lord had spoken to Moses. Then the Lord said to Moses, rise up early in the morning, present yourself before Pharaoh, and say to him, thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, let my people go, that they may serve me. For this time I will send all my plagues on you yourself, and on your servants, on your people, so that you may know that there is none like me in all the earth. For by now I could have put out my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, and you would have been cut off from the earth. But for this purpose I have raised you up, to show you my power, so that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. You are still exalting yourself against my people, and will not let them go. Behold, about this time tomorrow, I will cause very heavy hail to fall, such as never has been seen in Egypt from the day it was founded until now. Now therefore send, get your livestock, and all that you have in the field into safe shelter, for every man and beast that is in the field and is not brought home will die when the hail falls on them. Then whoever feared the word of the Lord among the servants of Pharaoh hurried his slaves and his livestock into the houses. But whoever did not pay attention to the word of the Lord left his slaves and his livestock in the field. And the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand towards heaven, so that there may be hail in all the land of Egypt, on man and beast and every plant of the field in the land of Egypt. Then Moses stretched out his staff towards heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail, and fire ran down to the earth. And the Lord rained hail upon the land of Egypt. There was hail and fire flashing continually in the midst of the hail, very heavy hail, such as never been in the land of Egypt since it became a nation. The hail struck down everything that was in the field in all the land, both man and beast. And the hail struck down every plant in the field and broke every tree of the field. Only in the land of Goshen, where the people of Israel were, was there no hail. Then Pharaoh sent and called Moses and Aaron and said to them, "This time I have sinned. The Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Plead with the Lord, for there has been enough of God's thunder and hail. I will let you go, and you shall stay no longer." Moses said to him, "As soon as I have gone out of this city, I will stretch out my hands to the Lord, the thunder will cease, and there will be no more hail, so that you may know that the earth is the Lord's. But as for you and your servants, I know that you do not yet fear the Lord God." The flax and the barley were struck down, for the barley was in the ear, and the flax was in bud. But the wheat and the emmer were not struck down, for they are late in coming up. And so Moses went out of the city from Pharaoh and stretched out his hands to the Lord, and the thunder and the hail ceased, and the rain no longer poured upon the earth. But when Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail and the thunder had ceased, he sinned yet again, hardened his heart, he and his servants. So the heart of Pharaoh was hardened, and he did not let the people of Israel go, just as the Lord had spoken through Moses. Amen. I want you to imagine that you've just turned on the TV and Ukrainian President Zelensky is addressing the world. He speaks to the microphone and he says, "We demand that Vladimir Putin, number 1, ends hostilities immediately, number 2, removes all troops today, and number 3, begins to pay us reparations." We know, he continues to say, that Putin will not listen to this demand today, but let me assure you that in 5 days he will. The war will be over in 5 days. You need to listen to me. We have secured a secret weapon which guarantees us victory. Each day that follows, unbelievable events will occur, and each day Putin will have opportunity to surrender. But he won't. Each of these unbelievable events that occur will bring Putin to his knees. And there ends the broadcast. On day 1, an area of land in Russian territory that precisely matches all of the invaded Ukrainian lands is burnt, mysteriously burnt, scorched, destroyed. And sort of the maps that we've been looking at, seeing the Russian invasion are sort of mirrored over on the border. You can see the same area of land that has been invaded is now burnt and torched inside Russian territory. How? How has that occurred? How has that happened? That's plague number 1. Now, on day 2, a dossier of Russian state secrets is released. All sorts of crimes against humanity proved. There's dirt on Putin. There's evidence of corruptions. There's recordings of anti-Ukrainian propaganda messaging. It's released. It's out there for everyone to see. The lies that they've been telling are now revealed. On day 3, again, mysteriously, every Ukrainian soldier in captivity is liberated. They're all found walking home. Not much explanation as to how it's happened, but they're free, telling the stories of their release. At the same time, every Russian troop that's on Ukrainian soil is somehow captured and imprisoned. All of those that are found to be on Ukrainian soil belonging to the Russian army are now captured. That's the end of day 3. On day 4, the Gazprom, the Russian gas company, report that all of their natural gas is gone. All of it. It's all gone. It's all disappeared overnight. And a few hours later, the Ukrainian national energy companies report that they are now flushed with natural gas. and are now selling it to the world. And they will continue to sell it to the world until the damages, the financial damages, have been repaid. On day 5, Russia is on its knees and embarrassed. No one can explain what's happened. Yet there's still no official end to hostilities. The war still continues. And on day 5, the day in which Zelensky said the war would end, Ukraine announced that they have in custody Vladimir Putin's 2 children and grandchildren. And they announced at the end of the day, well, within 3 hours, these family members will be killed if Russia doesn't surrender. The scorched land is in proportion to the land stolen. The dossier combats the lies that Russia have told. The troop transfer punishes the aggressors and rewards the defenders. The gas transfer forces Russia to pay back Ukraine. And the final plague is a brutal reminder of the grief and the loss to millions of families. Putin concedes and the war is over. The world has got a question. Who? Who is on your side? What did that? Who is your secret weapon? How did you manage to do that? The plagues upon Russia was something measured, something finite, something fixed. They were meaningful as well. They were targeted to meaningful moments in Russia's life. There was mastery and control. At the same time, those plagues liberated and they punished. Hoping a little bit that illustration, that imaginative 5 minutes, brings us into this chapter. It brings us into this chapter of global superpowers being brought to their knees, but being brought to their knees in a very specific way. Being brought to their knees with measured, meaningful signs and wonders that are designed both to punish Egypt and liberate Israel. We're going to consider all of the plagues, well, 9 of them anyway, this morning. I'm going to sort of treat them as a whole rather than work through them individually. The first thing I want to say is that the plagues declare his identity. You might have picked that up in the reading. If you read through the whole section, I think that would come through much more loudly. God is revealing himself. He's making himself known. He's making himself known to Egypt. I'm doing these things that you will know as a nation. He's making himself known to Pharaoh. I'm doing these things that you will know who I am. You're going through this that you will know something, that you'll see something, that you'll understand something. And we're told that he does it that the world will know. The world will know who reigns, who's in charge, who's in authority. And there's even a reference to the future generations knowing. The future generations of Israel being told that they would know that these stories would be passed on and passed on and passed on. That's the first thing really that needs to be said about these plagues. They declare who God is. I met up with Darren this week, and we got chatting a little bit about last week's sermon, and then that moved a little bit into starting to think about this week's sermon. And as we talked about the sort of topic of this week's sermon, the plagues, a smile sort of appeared on Darren's face. I hope he doesn't mind me sharing. And a bit of glee turned up on his face, and he said, yeah, that's when God showed up. That's when God showed up. And that's exactly right. That's the takeaway from the passage. God shows up. He said last time, didn't he? Now you'll see. Now you'll see. Now you're ready to behold what I will do. Here is the God of heaven, and he's revealing himself in great power, in great majesty. He's telling the world, I rule. I'm in complete control. And there are these moments in history where I make that plain and clear to all. I show up. As we consider God declaring his identity, there's 2 things I suppose I want to learn. Firstly is he's the God of creation. He's the God of creation. There are links in this account and to the way it's written. We haven't really got time to go into it. But in the way it's written, that links this book to the previous one that Moses has written, to Genesis. There are little hints and references to particularly the early chapters of Genesis. And so these plagues can be seen as almost decreation, a reversal of what God is doing in those early chapters, turning the world that he has made on its head, reversing the wonderful, bountiful explosion of creative power, and now reversing that, bringing that out in destructive power. What is God dealing with before creation? Well, he's dealing with chaos. He's dealing with a world without order. And he brings order. In creation, he brings order. He divides and separates. He brings pattern and order and design. And now he's turning the tables on an ordered society, and he's bringing chaos by his power. How did creation week begin? Well, it began with God saying, "Let there be light." How do our plagues end? With God saying, "Let there be darkness throughout the land." The one who brings light into a dark world is now switching those lights off, like only he can do. Again, think back to that creation story. There's an order and a pattern to that creation, isn't there? As humanity is put at the head of God's creative acts. Adam and Eve are put in that stewardship position to rule the plant and animal kingdom. And now look at the reversal as the animal kingdom comes out for humanity. Frogs and locusts and flies are used as weapons, no longer submitting and serving humanity, but now destroying it. As God stops the plagues, his power is on display. It's in his hands alone to bring this creation back to order. He's the one who's able to create in a moment disorder, and then at a prayer from Moses to switch it off and to stop it. As the children's song goes, he's got the whole world in his hands. All of it. It's all at his control. And so God is acting in this way, making clear to all that he is the creator. He is the living God. He is the one who has made the heavens and the earth. He has spoken these things into power. So for these things to change dramatically and violently and aggressively, to even be used as a weapon, all that needs to happen is for Moses to walk into a room and speak. Moses is to be as God to Pharaoh. All he has to do is speak, and these things happen. This is ultimate power. And so standing against him, being Pharaoh in this instance, is foolish. When the Creator shows up, when he turns up, well, it makes all of the other so-called gods sort of drift away into the shadows. They can't take the heat. They can't stand there. These aren't just general signs and wonders that generally speak of God as creator. They're specifically relevant to Egypt. They're God declaring that he is creator of the whole world, especially Egypt. I create all of this world. All of it is mine. The heavens and the earth, the plant life, the animal life, all of it's in my control, all of it under my authority, but particularly some of this Egyptian stuff. Some of this stuff that you really think you've got in your hands, that you really think you've got in your control. What would that be in your life? What would be significant things for God to do and use and change in your life, for him to display that power? The initial miracle that we've got in verse 9 of chapter 7, the staff into the serpent. The serpent, some of you'll know, but studying perhaps the Egyptians and the Pharaoh, seeing their headpieces with a sort of viper on top. The snake was a symbol of power, of authority in Egyptian culture. And so you might say, well, it's kind of, but the magicians are able to do that. They're able to do the same trick. That's not all that impressive. But look what happens to their snakes. They're gobbled up. They get eaten. They get devoured. What seems to be happening there is Aaron is sort of declaring war in their type of fight. He's fighting on their turf with their weapons. He's picking a fight with them. It's not a huge surprise that the magicians are able to do that trick. The significant bit is they don't last. They die. They're gobbled up. It points forward to the rest of the plagues, to the destruction of Egypt. What's happening in that moment as that staff is thrown down is a declaration of war, Yahweh against Egypt. We can use your weapons. You've got your snake. You've got your power. The Nile, 7 verse 19, already used by Yahweh to rescue Moses, is now turned to blood. The Nile was key in Egyptian society, key in its religion, key in its economy. It was significant. No Egypt without the Nile. And by turning it to blood, God is saying, it's my Nile. It's my river. And this river that brings you life, and this river that brings you prosperity and benefit, this river that you worship, well, I can turn it to blood. I can make it a source of death, a sign, a symbol, a declaration of death. Well, we could go on, talk about frogs and the Heket, the goddess of childbirth, who had a head of a frog. We could talk about hail and lightning, and Seth, the god of wind and storms, not being able to stand against it. We could talk about the crop cycle and Isis and Min. They can't stop the locusts destroying the crop. We can talk about the sun god, Re, who was worshipped in Egypt and adored. He can't turn the lights on when God's turned them off. And so God, the Creator, isn't just showing up. He isn't just turning up. He's humiliating Egypt. He's revealing it for what it is. False deities, false power, false hope, false confidence. We can join these two things up, can't we? God showing up in the world that he is, and at the same time using these specific examples to the Egyptian nation. He's saying, I'm the only true and living God. You may have power in all sorts of different areas, but it's nothing compared to who I am. Now, one commentator referred to Egypt and Pharaoh as a rag doll in God's hands, just being tossed back and forth, completely in his control. Utter dominance, mockery. Human pride has been put in its place, powerfully, terrifyingly. But God is doing more here than simply putting human pride in its place. Why is he showing up? Why has he come close? Well, he's the God of redemption. He's the God of the Hebrews. He's the God of his people. Again and again, as he introduces himself, that's who he's introducing himself as, the God of the Hebrews, the God of Israel. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm in the palace. That's what I'm about. That's what these plagues are about. Here's my desire. Let my people go. You're standing against me. Well, you're going to pay the price. Judgment is going to come your way. He is Yahweh, the God of promises, the God of commitments and covenants. We saw that last week. God preached that sermon to Moses. It's all about who he is. I'm the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob. I'm the one who's committed myself to you. I'm the God who is high and lifted up. And though I'm high and lifted up, I come close. I draw near. Though he resides in the heavens, unseen by human eyes, he's able to see the afflictions of his people. He's able to hear their cries and respond to their suffering. And surely the God of creation who's able to unwield such an otherworldly power isn't interested in little old me. He is an extraordinary God. Does he really care about ordinary people? And here in the story, that's exactly who God is revealing himself as. The one who comes alongside the ordinary, the weak, the sufferer. Without their support, without their belief, without their trust, without their faith, Moses is going without Israel's backing, without their confidence. He comes alongside. He makes their lives his business. He makes their victory his priority. He operates on their behalf. His messenger comes into the king's palace and says, let my people go, because they're mine. They belong to me. They may have forgotten it. I don't have much confidence in that name anymore, but they're mine. Now, I've committed myself to them, and that's what counts. Not their degree of faith in me, but me and my commitment to them. And so that, I think, is something of what these signs are about. Freedom for his people, benefiting them, helping them. He's working on their behalf. There's some crossover here because there's quite a bit of repetition in the passages, but I think these themes are worth separating a little bit. Secondly, I want to think about his plagues declaring his works. So the first thing we think about is identity, who he is. He's the creator God. That's who he is. He's the God who has made this world, and therefore the God to whom this world is accountable. And he's the God who, having made this world, has committed himself to certain people. He's the Redeemer God, the big cousin God, the God who comes near, the God who comes close, the God who commits himself to his people. And then what about his works? What can I expect when this God shows up? In the book of Revelation, right at the end of the Bible, we're reminded of these plagues. As John sees the forthcoming judgment of God, he talks about these plagues. They're very reminiscent of what we've got in these chapters in Exodus. And so it seems like what we've got here isn't just something in the past. It isn't just something for Sunday school. Can you remember them? Hail, locusts, darkness, flies, gnats. It isn't just Bible trivia. What we've got here is some sort of preview into the horrors of the future. We're seeing what God's going to do. As we learn what God did to Egypt, we're seeing what he's going to do in the future. We're seeing what it means for God to judge. And so we're not looking at a cartoon. We're looking at our futures. We're looking at the future of this world. We're looking at the future of these nations. We're looking at the future of our families. We're looking at what God does with people who stand against him. And without God breaking into our lives, that's all of us. Every one of us. And so the fearful note that are in these chapters should remain and should strike us hard. There are precious truths for us here. Part of this is recorded for us to remind ourselves of the glory and the power of God displayed for us. That's great. But in that bigger picture, we need to understand that this is also a revelation of God and his justice. And God hasn't changed. Not a new God, a different God. He's the same God. So when we see God show up and we ask the question, well, what does it mean if God's going to show up in my life? What is it going to mean the day I meet him? Oh, here we're given a glimpse. What did it mean for Egypt, for Pharaoh, for God to show up and display his power in these ways? Well, firstly, he comes to bring judgment. That's part of God's work. Judgment. There's justice in these plagues. There's victory, there's power, there's this element of war and destruction, but there's also justice. There's also something measured, balanced about them. That's why I tried to bring that in that illustration. The plagues that I tried to line up for Ukraine and Russia wanted to be balanced and measured according to the things that had been done. This is a further significance of these plagues, that they're measured responses to a king who has dared to defy Israel. God has promised that he would bless whoever blesses Israel. And Egypt initially was a blessing to Israel. It welcomed Joseph. His family had kicked him out, and they eventually welcomed him. Eventually. And he benefited them and blessed them, and God blessed not just Egypt, but other nations in the world through Joseph. So God had kept his promises. He'd blessed a nation that had blessed Israel. But then by the time we come to the book of Exodus, that's not how they're treating Israel. And as they curse Israel, God had promised to curse any nation that cursed his people. And here's God being true to his word. You stood against my people. That was a mistake. That means you stand against me. In these plagues, we see some measured justice from God. Let's go back to the Nile. What was the Nile being used for in the early chapters of Exodus? Well, it was the place of execution for Israelite baby boys. There's some balance there, isn't there? As they see now that river turn to blood, that's kind of what it was. It was an instrument of execution. It was a place where Hebrew babies died. And so they're being shown face to face with the horrors of their hands. You turned this river to blood. I'm showing you your sin. I'm showing you your darkness. I'm revealing it to you. It's a reminder of the sin of the past, but it also points to that final plague and that shedding of blood. Soon it'll be their children. It's horror there. In chapter 9, 8 and 12, we've got the plague of the boils. There's an interesting moment where God tells Moses to get some dust from the kiln and to throw it. And that's going to be the source of the boils. That's where the boils are going to come from. At least that's going to be the trigger. Well, what's going on with the kiln? The kiln's where you make bricks. It's been part of their slavery, hasn't it? Part of Pharaoh's ramping up against Israel was to increase that labor, make that harder, make that labor harder. And Moses goes right into the very center of that slavery, into the kiln, into the place of the blood and the sweat and the tears, and he throws it back at Egypt. Have this in your face. It's measured. I wanted to bring this out more clearly. I don't have time. I might send around a handout if it's of use, just the way these plagues are arranged. It's helpful to see them. They can seem quite, not random, but they seem different. There's sort of some things repeating, other things aren't repeating. And there is a pattern. They seem to be in cycles of 3, 6, and then 9. And yeah, that's a helpful way of seeing them. And in those cycles, things get increasingly worse, increasingly severe. You can live with a bloody river for a week. Not particularly pleasant, but you can live with it. It's very hard to live with all of your crops destroyed and all of your cattle destroyed. It's pretty hard to live in complete and utter darkness. They get increasingly worse. And the treatment of Israel got increasingly worse, didn't it? Steadily worse, steadily darker. And this is the God of justice. He brings perfect justice. He's able to measure wrongdoing and bring about fitting judgments against people who have sinned in this way. Touching on this brings us to a fairly difficult, challenging topic, which is Pharaoh's heart. Challenging because it's hard to work out quite what's going on, or at least on first reading it's hard to work out quite what's going wrong. We've got references to Pharaoh being active in hardening his own heart. Chapter 8, verse 15 is an example of that. Pharaoh hardens his heart. We've got examples of that being a fairly neutral. No one's responsible. It just says Pharaoh's heart was hardened. 7 verse 13 is an example of that. And then we have ones in which God is active in hardening Pharaoh's heart. 7 verse 3 is an example of that. So we've got 3 different ways Moses is recording that Pharaoh's heart gets hard. It gets hard. Pharaoh hardens it himself. He's in disobedience against God, and he's hardening himself to that. And then there's this mysterious one of God doing it. God being active in Pharaoh's heart and making that heart hard. I think the best thing to do is to read it straight off the page. God is telling us what we need to know. There's a human responsibility as a human being created in the image of God to not have a hard heart towards him, to be responsive to his word, to delight in his presence, to seek his face, to seek to do his will. And when we don't do that, we have a hard heart towards God, and we're responsible for that. We harden our hearts. The sound of the gospel pings off us. We're not interested in it. We've hardened our hearts. We rebel. We reject. We don't want God's authority. We don't want his voice. We don't want his presence. We don't want him near. We harden our hearts. And then there's also the element of God's sovereignty too. Here it's seen in God actively hardening Pharaoh's heart. That seems to be about God purposefully hardening Pharaoh's heart that his glory might be displayed. that he knew and made Pharaoh to be resistant to him so that these plagues could run their full course, so justice could be fully worked out, fully seen, that the nations of the world would see Yahweh as the God that he really was. And he would see Pharaoh for the false God that he really was. That God had a purpose and a use for him. And so he made his hard heart as a way, as a means to that purpose, to bring himself glory, to bring himself renown, and for Israel's benefit too. You have a heart problem, the broader Bible's teaching tells us. You've got one. And you don't have an answer to it. That heart is naturally hard, and you can't soften it. You're not in control, you're not able to. Sometimes at the end of the sermon, there'll be one here, there'll be a gospel appeal. There'll be a time where I say, well, this is the good news of the gospel. I want you to come and put your trust. And if you try and join these two things up, it's hard to make sense of it. Why are you telling me to come if my heart is hard and I can't do anything to soften it? Because I've got great confidence that through preaching, God will soften. God will work. God will use those words to soften your heart. But it's still not your control. Still not in your hands to soften it. And so you need to cry out to God in mercy, soften my heart. I am hard. I do reject you. And I got no good reason to. Lord, make it soft. Lord, change me. Make me new. So God is bringing justice. But alongside bringing justice, he's also bringing salvation. As each of these plagues stops, there's a reminder that the God who brings judgment is also the one who relents, who shows mercy. We just saw earlier in the message that these plagues are terrifying acts of decreation, a bit like the flood, God reversing his creative activity. The God who brought life in Genesis 1 and 2 is bringing death to plant life. He's bringing death to livestock, things that he's created. If it's he who brings death, it's also he who grants life. He's the only one who can end these plagues. The plagues tend to end, not always end, but they tend to end with a prayer to end the plague. And so God ends it. The Egyptian magicians are quite funny to trace their story through these few chapters. They're there for the first two and they peter out by the third. It's another helpful way of seeing those cycles. They sort of disappear. They're able to recreate the first two. And by the third, chapter 8, verse 19, they're saying this is the finger of God. This is out of our league. It's got nothing to do with us. But even with the ones they could recreate, they couldn't stop it. They couldn't reverse it. They could turn water into blood, but they couldn't stop the Nile being full of blood. God alone can do that. The second way we see God's salvation is in these distinctions. In the second cycle of plagues, we see this element of distinction. God is able to, at the same time, punish Egypt and to protect Israel. He's able to say, lights off in Egypt and lights on in Goshen. Chapter 8:22. So we see that God is working to judge and administer justice. He's also working to, 8:22 is the first time he makes those distinctions. Through that judgment of Egypt, he's able to save and redeem Israel. He's doing the same two things at once. He's able to bring justice as needed, judgment upon the world, and through that to save. And that's seen here clearly in the plagues. It's seen obviously in the plagues. Egypt suffer, Israel don't. But it's also seen at the cross of Calvary. What do I expect if God shows up? Well, he has shown up. And one thing to expect is not for your expectations to be met. These stories went into the lifeblood of the Israelite people, didn't they? This is our God. This is Yahweh. That day he showed up. They have a meal that continues to tell them the story, to preach the liturgy to them of who this God is and the strength and the power that he displayed that day. And so that builds into their ideas of victory and of kingdom later on in life. And so when they're hoping for the Messiah, they've got these sorts of ideas in their mind, these sorts of demonstrations of power and demonstrations of strength. And there's a sense in which when Christ's on earth, he's able, in a sense, to display them. Extraordinary signs of power. Walking on water. Healing the sick. He's doing creative acts, isn't he? Recreative acts, bringing the dead back to life. So the decreation that sin and fall has brought into this world, he's turning back. He's showing the new world that he's able to bring in. They're extraordinary, powerful things that he's able to do. And yet the scene of his greatest victory doesn't seem to be one of power, but one of abject weakness. Here in Exodus 7 to 10, we've seen the God deal in signs and wonders, defeating pride and humanity, the pride of humanity with undeniable power. But on Calvary, the one who has worked those signs and wonders hangs in profound weakness. What's happening there? It's unexpected, isn't it? It doesn't go with the trajectory that we're building, for this is the way God saves, with power and wonder. Well, I don't think it's the meaning of Moses, but I think there's a little glimmer perhaps in the story that we've read that can perhaps give us a window into understanding what's happened. Exodus 9 verse 18. I don't know how many times I've read these chapters. I've never really spotted this bit before. This is during the plague of the hail. Behold, about this time tomorrow I will cause very heavy hail to fall, such as never been in Egypt, from the day it was founded until now. Now therefore get your livestock and all that you've seen in the field into safe shelter. For every man and beast that is in the field is not brought home will die when the hail falls on them. Normally the judgment just falls on Egypt and Israel's okay. I guess they could have run to Goshen if they would listen, but really it falls on them. Here there's a little glimmer of hope. Look, there's a judgment coming. Get shelter. Get hidden. Hail, lightning, hail like you've never seen before. Find shelter. Find safety. The judgment of God is coming on this land. Find safety. Don't die in the field. And we're told the ones that hear the word listen and find shelter, and others, it would seem, don't. Last Saturday we had Bay Youth here, and there was a torrential downpour for a good, felt like an hour beforehand, and all the leaves had sort of blocked up all of the drains, and the water sort of rose from the middle of the road, where the sort of high point in the road is, to the pavement. So it's like way up, almost up to my knee in water, trying to wade here. Some kids were sort of piggybacked into the building. And as me and Phoebes were sort of driving around just beforehand, getting stuff lined up, the rain was like a wall on our windscreen, just pouring down. And at that point, I just said, surely there's not any more water in the sky. Surely that's enough. And that second, you can tell Phoebe, you can ask Phoebe, that second it stopped. Really weird. Like all of a sudden, I said, well, surely there's not enough. That's it for water now. Doom. And I came back. I didn't feel quite so powerful, didn't feel quite so magic, didn't feel quite so capable. In the car, though, we had shelter from that. It was a wall of a torrent of rain. And what God is offering them here is shelter. Run to safety. Now, what's happening at Christ on the cross? Why does he seem so weak? Why does he seem so helpless? Well, because the judgment that we've talked about, the horrors, the plagues, the hail of God's wrath is coming upon him. It's being poured out on him. He's facing it. He's experiencing it. The pride of humanity deserves that, and yet Christ has served his Father humbly and faithfully. And that wrath, that anger, that retribution is being poured out on him. Why? So that he can provide a shelter. So that he can provide a safe place. So people like you and people like me can come close, can come near. And not because we deserve it, not because we've lived better lives, but simply because we've heard his name. We've heard his name, and it's been explained to us that that is the place of safety. We all deserve God's judgment, but because you've heard that name, and because you've heard he is a Savior, and because he died for people like you, that you don't have to face that judgment. You don't have to face that wrath. You can come under that shelter. You can heed that warning. And so that judgment that isn't just historic and in Israel's history, but is our world's future, where God shows up once and for all and judges everybody. He weighs up everything that we've done, holds us accountable. That justice, that anger is laid on him. And just like that car took a hammering in the rain and we're bone dry, Jesus Christ took a hammering and effectively we're bone dry. Doesn't touch us, doesn't come near us. We come into his arms. That's God's redemption. It's God's saving. It's his desire to, in itself, send himself to be the propitiation, to send himself to be the car, the wrath bearer, that people like us can go free, can come close. May God use these challenging, fearful chapters to speak his word into our hearts and lives. Amen.